Okay. Now, one aspect of Japanese history and culture that you're probably already very familiar with, I'm assuming that most of you have done some study in Japanese history. That's why I'm not giving you a lot of details. I'm giving you just sort of an overall picture, because I assume by the time you've come to Japan, you've already done some background in Japanese history. Well, one thing I'm sure you've noticed is the fact that there are, in Japanese culture, there are periods of response to outside influences, taking in the outside influences, and then transforming them into something that's more Japanese. But there are periods of great openness and receptivity to outside cultures. And then there are periods of consolidation and rejection of outside culture. And that goes through waves in Japanese history and culture. And so, again, in the 7th and 8th centuries, Buddhism and Chinese culture was welcomed into Japan. Then there was consolidation of that. And then, again, when the Jesuits came, at first, you know, there was openness to Christianity and there was toleration of it for a while, and then there was a rejection and the closing of the country in the Edo period. And then, 250 years later, there's another openness period, the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji period, where they were again open to the West. Well, actually, they were sort of forced to. It wasn't something they chose, because the Western powers started pounding on the door to get in. The island of Dejima in Nagasaki, near Nagasaki, had become the only entry port for Western ideas through the Dutch. They decided they couldn't, the Japanese decided they'd allow the Dutch merchants to set up their factories there and to have interaction with the West and nobody else. But then, like I said, these other countries started knocking on the door. And the Tokugawa period authorities did get guns. They started making cannons that could protect their ports, protect their areas against these foreign ships, and they started even lobbing cannonballs at any ship that come close, and so on. But in 1853, 4 warships under the command of Matthew Perry called at Uraga at the mouth of Edo Bay. And these big black ships with the big smokestacks, not just the sails, but big smokestacks, moved into Tokyo Bay, Edo Bay, and forced the Tokugawa government to respond. It was by 1855, there were treaties that had been signed with America, with Russia, with other countries. They were trying to forestall the takeover of the country by these foreign powers, and so they designated certain port cities as places where these foreigners could come and live and transact business. And so it was just certain port cities that were open to them. But within those port cities, the Japanese had to concede control. They didn't have control over those port cities. And they viewed these treaties as very unequal treaties. And this is what spurred the Japanese government then to change. We've got to address these Western powers. If we don't want to be overcome, we've got to learn their technology. We've got to become as strong as they are. We have got to show them that we are worthy of equal treaties. Treaties that view us as equal partners, not as unequal partners. And so there was this massive push to modernize and inviting foreign experts in to teach them all they needed to know. And they sent delegations of people to America and the Western Europe to learn what they needed to learn. And they sent people overseas to study. And they invited all these people into Japan to teach. And some of them were there as teachers. A teacher of a school for samurai young people down in Kumamoto. And then you had Clark, who went up to Hokkaido and taught in the agricultural college there. And they won their students to Christ. They started having Bible studies, and they became Christians. And then you had Hepburn and a whole group of people who came into Yokohama. Hepburn was a doctor. And then there were people, and eventually that school became Tokyo University. So you had people coming in with skills. You had engineers, architects. They introduced the railroads, and all of this modernization began. You had a very fast industrialization. Although the country was basically still, agrarian, there was this huge push toward a new country, a new culture, and with that came an openness to Christianity. After all, what was the behind all this power of these Western countries? And some of them saw Christianity as part of that. But it was this period that we had the formal introduction of Christianity back into the country. The Protestants also had a huge impact in many, many different ways. They did have a very high level of scholarship themselves, most of the early missionaries, and they were there to teach. And so they had an impact just because they opened up education for many people. But they also were modeling a different kind of life as well. Now again, could the Japanese distinguish between what was Christian and what was Western? No, they couldn't. They felt it was all the same thing. And there were people at this point who said, well, maybe we should become a Christian nation, you know? They didn't know what that meant, but that's what they were saying. We could be recognized. Then the West would see that we're worthy of renegotiating those treaties. This was the motivation behind most of what was going on here, including their openness to Christianity at that point. But it was at this point that we see also some of the early converts that came into the church. Some of the group in Kumamoto became known as the Kumamoto Band. This group of samurai young people went to a mountain and they declared that Jesus was now their daimyo. Jesus was now their Lord, and they would die for Jesus. The group in Hokkaido, who started out of this Bible study that William Clark had there at the college, became known as the Sapporo Band. And they too, that included a number of people, including Uchimura Kanzo, who became a very well-known journalist and writer, and leader and thinker among Japanese Christians. Then there was the Yokohama Band with Hepburn and Balog and many of the others there from several different denominations who were working, and people coming to Christ, and groups. And the first Protestant church then was formally founded in 1872, which was when the ban on Christianity was finally lifted and it became legal. Up until that time, many of these converts did experience various kinds of persecution. But in 1872, the first church, and the building for that first church is right there in Yokohama. If you haven't gone to see it, I recommend it. It's the Kaigan Church, Yokohama Kaigan Church. This church building actually is significant for you people at Send. That was one of the sites of the GI Gospel Hour after World War II, out of which your mission was birthed. But anyway, this is the time when all of this new thing started happening. Other believers that came out of that era, Danjo Ebino, and another person who he became a leader among the congregational churches. And Nijima Jo was a young man who stowed away on a ship that took him to America, and he became a Christian from the samurai class, because these were the people who had access to most of the missionaries and to the schools that they had started, particularly. So there was a rapid growth of Christianity, and where it really took off was when the Japanese became leaders. There were some areas when the Japanese became the leaders, then it really took off. The missionaries were absolutely essential, but this was all part of the growth of the church at that period. Other impact on society. I like to mention especially the Salvation Army. In 1895, Yamamura Gunpei became the leader of the Salvation Army in Japan. And he led the Salvation Army in a campaign to eliminate the slavery of the geisha girls. Girls who were sold into slavery to the geisha houses from from farm families, poor families, and they were sold into slavery, into prostitution in the geisha houses. And the Salvation Army led the public campaign to outlaw that practice. And they were attacked in the streets and bloodied by thugs that the geisha houses had hired to attack them and so on. But eventually it passed the Japanese parliament. And so there were many areas like this where Christianity had a huge impact on Japan and Japanese culture. And okay, but then, and okay, but then, was this campaign for negotiating these treaties successful? No. They were trying so hard, but it wasn't successful. There was another element I need to mention before I go further, and that is when these converts then started getting theological education to become leaders in the denominations, where did they go? Many times they were sent to America or to Europe to seminary to study, to come back, because they hadn't been developed yet seminaries here. Well, when those that went to Europe, where did they go? They went to German seminaries, and this was the height of the liberal movement in Christianity in Europe at the time, doubting the Bible, doubting the divinity of Christ, denying many of the basic doctrines of the faith. And these converts, these new converts from Japan, are studying, how are they to respond? Well, this must be the truth. And they come back to Japan. And so we had a huge, rapid growth in the 1880s. But in the 1890s, when these converts started coming back, all of a sudden, the Japanese believers say, well, we got Christianity from the West. This must be true. We accepted this. The confidence to evangelize vanished among the average Japanese. I can't know whether this part of the Bible is true or not. I have to leave that to the teacher. Suddenly, evangelism, shrunk. Suddenly, you had an impact on the national church that was really detrimental, and that growth, that huge expansion stopped. It didn't stop completely, but it was no longer that rapid growth because of the impact of liberal theology among the Japanese. At the same time, there was an increasing nationalistic reaction. These Western powers are not negotiating these treaties, so we're going to push back. And there was a rise in the idea of getting rid of the foreigners. And there was a rise of, let's have our own empire then. Instead of letting the British and these other countries have their empire in Asia, we're going to have our own. They ended up having a war with Russia. And they beat Russia. Whoa, that got the attention of the West. Here was this country, Japan, that had beaten the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, and that got the attention. And so suddenly they thought, okay, we've made it. And it was as a result of the Russo-Japanese War and the coming of age, the way they saw it, of their country, that they were able to renegotiate some of these treaties. And so you had a nationalism that really took hold, a national identity in Japan. And that also went toward, then we don't need this foreign religion either. And you had, following that, a revival of Shintoism. Shintoism, until this time, had never been systematized. It was basically a local religion of people in the local area, asking the gods for good crops or whatever, or remembering your ancestors and honoring your ancestors. It had never been systematized, and suddenly there was a whole class of Shinto theologians who were coming up with a systematic approach to Shinto. They were actually borrowing a lot from Christianity to do so, by the way. And we're even using Christian terms in some of the writings at this point. But they were trying to develop a national identity and using Shinto. And of course, the emperor became the center of that national identity. Of course, he had been the center from the start throughout, as far as their national identity, throughout their history. But it became systematized and wedded to Shinto in a way that had never been before during this Meiji period. And So you had the period of openness, and then you had the period of rejection. And it had to do with the connection of Christianity being Western, being that foreign religion. So it was also during this time that among the Christians, they were seen as the outsiders. Why? Because they were resisting this nationalism and the authoritarianism, the rescript on education that was published during the Meiji period gave a very Confucian vision of society, very structured, and who you're responsible to, and obey, and so on. And then even the Meiji Constitution, again, then institutionalized that and gave the emperor the top slot and everything. And so the Christians, again, because of the idea of the image of God in man, the value of the individual, were resisting this authoritarianism constantly. And many of them became the leaders in social movements for freedom. This is about Christian converts and social protest in Meiji Japan. This was their identity. They were the outsiders, and they were resisting this nationalism, including the war effort. Many of them opposed the war with Russia, and many of them became pacifist at that point. And especially some of the leaders, became anti-war. So here you had the outsiders and social protest that were important there. But as the era changed into the Taisho period, there was again another movement in Christianity that became very influential, and this was social action. Many Christian converts became leaders in their communities. Kagawa Toyohiko started several different things, including co-ops, and Christians started the agricultural co-ops. These were a way that the farmers could work together, again, for their own interest. Part of it was so that they could resist the government or influence the government, so they started working together. And the co-ops, even today, you have that go around to the neighborhoods and you order food or whatever together and so on. That was started by Christians, as well as the many other social movements that were started. Actually, Christians started political movements too that became the socialist party in Japan. Let's see, there were a number of other ones. There were some specific ones. Well, I won't go into all the details, but the main point is that there were people who were responding to the needs of the Japanese people, the poor, and the farmers and so on, and they were meeting those needs. And these were Christians. And this became part also of the Christian identity in Japan. And when many people think of Christianity in Japan, they think of this idea of loving other people and of meeting their needs. And that's a very positive image. And during that time, Kagawa and others held huge mass crusades, and where they would have, thousands of people in preaching the gospel. And there were many people who came to Christ in the 1920s. There was a great effort at that all over Japan. And that was another period of responsiveness to the gospel. because of the impact of Christians on the lives of their communities, and so on. So this is not a new thing. But, okay, so now we are into the 1930s. Again, a nationalist reaction. Why? Well, a lot of it had to do with the way Japan was trying to expand and build up, and but the other nations of the world, particularly the West, were not letting them. This is the way they viewed it. America passed an anti-immigration law that rejected Japanese immigration. The Japanese were trying to get markets, get raw materials. The only raw material Japan had for industrialization was coal. They didn't have anything else. And so they were going to these other countries around Asia, especially, to try to get whatever. And eventually oil and all of these things. They were looking for the resources, iron and so on, to build all these buildings and all these ships and so on. They were looking for all the natural resources. And sometimes the Western countries were trying to limit them. And so they felt that they were being forced, being pressured by the outside. And so what was the reaction? Nationalism. And then the Japanese army went into China, again, to get resources. They went into Manchuria, which was rich in natural resources. And they took over Manchuria and made it into Manchukuo. Then what was the response of the Christians during this time? Well, when they took over Manchuria, there were Christian churches that says, hey, this is an opportunity for us to be missionaries to the Chinese. And they actually sent missionaries to Manchukuo, to Manchuria, to evangelize Chinese. But then Japan took over Korea and annexed it to Japan. Again, but there they had already had Christians, and there were already Christian churches there. But again, some Japanese went to Korea at that point too, among the churches. So, in a sense, the churches here were riding along the political developments of Japan. And in a sense, they were sort of riding the coattails of the nationalism too. But they saw it as opportunities. Same thing that the American missionaries and the British missionaries, the British Empire, they were following along, and here there were opportunities, so we can't exactly criticize them for doing that too. That's one thing. So anyway, during this period, there was an expansion of the gospel, but the other thing that was happening then among the churches in the 1930s was the impact of German theology, particularly neo-orthodoxy. Now, there had been a period in the 1920s when Danjo Ibina and Masahisa Uemura were having debates over the divinity of Christ and so on. And that division was very evident there. And then when in the 1930s, when neo-orthodoxy came in, again doubting or denying the absolute veracity of the scripture. The Bible becomes God's word when it grabs you and you have an experience. Neo-orthodoxy that fit perfectly with Japanese culture, perfectly, and so on. There was a tremendous impact. In fact, some call it the German captivity of the church in Japan, meaning captivity to German theology at that period. 80% of the churches by that time in the 30s had become either liberal or neo-orthodox. Firmly evangelical churches, they still existed, but liberal and neo-Orthodox theology had come to dominate during that period. But people were still getting saved. There were still people who were coming to Christ. But in the 1930s, this identity of Japan and Shintoism was very, very strong. So, what happened? If you're going to be a loyal Japanese, then you have to bow to the image of the emperor before your church service. There's in the church, picture of the emperor, and you bow toward the emperor before your church service. And if you're going to preach about the second coming of Christ, your pastor could end up in jail, and he did. Many pastors, particularly Pentecostal and holiness pastors, were put in jail because they were teaching that Christ is going to come back and the emperor's going to bow to Christ? No way. And then there was the shrine issue. The government was saying, well, the Shinto shrine is not religion. It's just a way of acknowledging, your identity as a Japanese and honoring your nation and the emperor. So, do you take your kindergarten children to the Shinto shrine and they all bow at the Shinto shrine? Many churches did. Why? Why did the churches compromise in this way? Because the government came to them and said, look, you can have a part, they came and recruited the churches for their nationalistic cause. And the church leaders said, we're in. We're no longer the outsiders. We've been accepted. And so we'll go along with all this. After all, in your heart, you're still worshiping Christ. In your heart, it's this, whatever you do on the outside, it's not religious. When you go to the shrine, it's not religious. It's the omote and the honne. It's the idea of whatever is true in your heart, that's fine, But let's conform to everybody else and show we're loyal Japanese. And that's really what happened. So what happens when the Korean churches are being forced to and told to go to the shrine and worship at the shrine too? Yes, they weren't even Japanese, but the Koreans were told, well, now you're a Japanese, now you're part of Japan, and so you guys have to go to the shrine and worship too. And so the Korean churches appealed to the Japanese churches. Hey, what's this all about? Can't you tell our government that we can't do that? And the Japanese sent a delegation over and they say, oh, it's not religious. You need to go to the shrine and worship at the shrine. And many Koreans suffered persecution, death. There's at least one instance in which a church was burned down with the people inside because they had refused to go to the shrine. Nakaichi Ando, who was a missionary in Manchuria, and he refused to worship at the shrine and was jailed. He later became the head of the Domei, a denomination after the war. As I said, there were holiness preachers who were jailed, and some of them died in jail. But many of the churches compromised and went along with, at least on the outside, with the nationalism of that period. This was a period that has an effect today. Much of what you see in the post-war period, which we'll be getting to next, is a result of reaction to this. Now, we're out of time here, so here's the next group of questions. What impact did the Bible have on Japanese society? How do we build on the rich tradition of social action? Why did the churches compromise with Shinto nationalism? What pressure is there today to compromise with the culture? Okay?
What year was the Bible translated into Japanese?
Okay, the Bible was 1888 was when the Bible was published, and it was then revised in 1917. The New Testament was completely revised and everything and put together in 1917. That was the old the first Japanese translation. Yes.
And this was the first Protestant translation.
Yes, of the entire Bible.
Of the entire Bible.
Yes.
Completed by.
There had been small portions of the Bible previously. In 1837, some fishermen had been drifted across the ocean and ended up in Canada, ended up in Macau, where they met a missionary who helped them, who they helped translate the Gospel of John into Japanese. That was the first full gospel portion that was translated. But anyway, it was this 1888 was the actual first Protestant Bible. Yes.
Now I know Nakata Junji was very famous in the Wrestling and Holiness.
Yes.
Was he ever jailed?
Not that I know of, but
I know he came into.
Yeah, Nakata Junji was in the early period there, was at Moody Bible Institute and came back to Japan with the Cowans, the couple, missionary couple, and they together formed the.
Because I know he was a little bit awry on this theology towards the end of his life too.
Well, a lot of people did, but some of them came back. There were a number of people who, at one point, seemed to deny part of the basic faith, but then came back too.
Okay, I'd like to take about 5 minutes or so because we want to get back here with Don for this last section. So if you can just get into your groups again and look at one or two of these questions for 5 minutes and we'll come back. Okay, thank you.